Yeah, Colonel Payne put it pretty succinctly, so that's exactly what we're doing here. Just gotta step back and then go back to the rudimentary to basics. I think a lot of you, the switches were starting to come on when we were talking about the fighting products and talking about things that you already know about, and seeing that divisions fundamentally do the same thing. They've got a much more complicated problem set, and that's what they're going to kind of lay out here, so you can sort of understand what divisions are doing. The division staff, and then just as important to understand that the division is a headquarters that stands over the top of fighting elements. And so what they're doing to resource those elements for the fight, and also to shape for the deep fight and for what's going on in the future to allow the brigades to fight is kind of what they're going to cover here.
Just real quick, hey, this isn't just for the folks at the front table, right? We're all tracking that. If you have a question, ask your question, because I guarantee there's someone else sitting there that would ask the same question. Make sense? And you know, the rule of there's no stupid questions. Yeah, there are stupid questions, but you're not going to ask any. You know, no one's going to ask how to solve world hunger here today. So I think we're good to go. Right?
I'll ask the stupid questions. It'll be all right. The one question that I've had since I was in E4 was nobody's been able to answer is, what does the puree button on a blizzard do? So we're ready on that one, and roll through with the class.
Sure, absolutely. So switching on that, that's a good one. So team, hey, so yesterday we talked about division operations as C2 is a functionality, and we talked about it as an integrated function of what divisions do. But again, this brief is going to focus. You'll see some of the slides you saw yesterday. We'll have a chance to kind of review that, open it back up with questions or dialogue, and then kind of move forward with that. So without anything further on that, we'll move on to the next slide. This brief talks about, next right. This brief talks about kind of three big things. One, it looks at what the roles and responsibilities are for a division. And we're going from that, we're pulling from doctrine. You'll see that in the references in the next one. It looks at division organizations, so what you can expect to see out of division. And then it focuses a little bit more in terms of CP operations. And so some of that will be discussed later this afternoon in a breakout about CPs and CP displacement. But for the larger audience, it's helpful just to get a broad overview of what we're talking about. Okay, next slide. References here. So, references? Thanks. On the references, what you see is it's got a lot of different doctrines. Some of it's dated. I will tell you, the vast majority of this brief, it's pulled from FM 3-94, which is the most recent publication, and it's Armies, Corps, and Divisions. And so that is dated as of July 21. And so most of this stuff, if you want to look it up in doctrine, comes from FM 3-24, or 3-94, right at the bottom, chapter 5. Explicitly talks about division organizations, role and responsibilities for that. So save you some time digging through the doctrine on that. Chapter 5 is which we're looking at. Next slide. So it was talked about yesterday a little bit, but like for the majority of us, particularly those of us who are a little bit older, we grew up in a coin environment, right? So we went back and forth between a couple different places in third world countries, trying to win hearts and minds. And part of the problem set with that is that it's really hard to do. You got to spread yourself out pretty far across the board. At one organization, we even had a division headquarters battalion become a battle space hub. It's not in doctrine, but it's certainly a way to help solve that problem. And the reason is because you got to spread out, and you got to get out there in the population. Right? Well, what that did is it drove to a brigade-centric organization in the Army. But around 2013, 2014, we transitioned away from coin-centric operations back to large-scale combat operations. LSCO, LISCO. If you hear us say LISCO, that's what that means. And so LISCO is just inherently a more complicated operation. And because of that, you need more enablers to maximize combat power at decisive place and time. That's why the Army shifted away from brigade-centric organizations to a division-centric organization. So now divisions are the unit of action. Does that kind of make sense? Any questions, comments on that?
Since you brought up the history of it, and Colonel Manners will remember this as well, but really the BCT-centric concept for the Army, the BCTs as a unit of action, roots back more towards the 90s with General Shinseki when he was going objective force, right? And the idea was, post 91, we were the sole hegemon in the world, the premier global power, and there weren't any near peer competitors. And there was this idea, everybody's heard of peace dividend. So it was kind of this idea where operations in the future wouldn't be large scale in nature. They would be small scale, they would be quick, and we wanted to have the capability to get a force in, be able to be precise, be quick in executing, quick violence of action, accomplish our mission, and then get out. And so that was kind of the concept that drove to a BCT-centric force. It just happened to fit and nest fairly well as we moved into surge and moved into post OIF-1 into the COIN type of environment, so where BCTs, they weren't necessarily the unit of maneuver, but it was a good concept because it pushed all of the things that used to dwell at corps, at division, because of the way the battlefield framework said they had to fight down to the BCT. So the brigade headquarters grew, the brigade, particularly the S2 and the S3 sections grew. We pushed a lot of things down into the company. Everybody remembers the FIST teams and the intel structure that came down there. And so that was kind of how we evolved and morphed. We never got to the objective force, but what we ended up having to do was spin a lot of things out to give to the force. And now we're kind of going back to the future, getting back to a division-centric organization with the rise of China, with the rise of Russia as other world superpowers with comparative capability, and back into a near peer type of fight. And so that's really what's going to sort of driving this. But for clarity, the BCT-centric model really actually preceded the COIN fight.
What's missing from that statement? We talked about it yesterday, and I've already given my rewrite guidance to the folks. But what's missing? Yes. So something to the ilk of requesting coordinates external enablers to increase the lethality of the brigades. Something like that, right? Because the division commander's fight is deep, right? This necessarily doesn't paint that picture, does it? If you read that. It sounds like he's just coordinating brigades around the battlefield, which necessarily isn't true. So just keep that in the back of your mind. This could be why they, the division might not completely understand its role in the deep fight, if they don't. Okay, good.
So just one question, Chef. So is that why we've seen a shift for Compo 1 units with the CSSBs and now DSSBs just trying to realign because we going like a division level fight as opposed to like BCT focus? I know like yes. Compo 2 and 3, we still see the CSSBs out there sprinkle out, but when you like 101st, 82nd, those DSSBs just trying to realign for that division fight. Is that what's driving that?
Absolutely, and you'll see this in a couple of slides. We'll talk about the specific organization of the division. Okay. But as a teaser, yeah, that's why we've gone back to a Div Vardy, as an actual brigade headquarters with an 06 commander there, who dual hats as the FIST coordinator. And so same thing for the sustainment brigade, and to a greater degree, as we start integrating the MEBs as well, you're going to start seeing that. So, and we'll talk that in just a bit. But next slide. So as we kind of touched on, the in document right now, it says the division headquarters can do kind of these four things right here. It's organically designed to do this. So when we think of a tactical unit, I mean, we tend to think small unit things, and again, that's a vestige of the previous doctrine and contracts that Colonel Blanchard played out, right? But the in doctrine, the division is, and frankly, even previous doctrine stated, the division always was a tactical headquarters, right? With significant augmentation, it can get to these three other things. We're not going to touch on that in this brief here. We're going to focus more on the tactical operational side of that. But just keep in mind, in doctrine, it can go from the tactical level to kind of bridge the operational level as well with that appropriate augmentation. Okay? I don't want to delve too far into it. We'll get to the next one. So this one really talks about, and this lists out some of the things here. And as Colonel Manners absolutely rightly pointed out, synchronizing, it's still in the previous doctrine. So when you look at 2014, when it describes what a division does there, synchronizing is absolutely a part of that. Here, it changes to say mass effects at the decisive point, right? But for anybody that's been in the Army a day or two, in order to mass effects, you have to synchronize. Because if you don't do it, so even if synchronization is not verbatim in the text itself or in doctrine, certainly the concepts behind it are there. And so the other critical things here, and this is going to be, telling for you guys, part of the discussion on the JADGET, right? And their decision to kind of omit the JADGET, the 28th ID's decision to kind of omit the JADGET, was Colonel Bunch absolutely pointed out. I don't care what you call it, but you still have the responsibility to do it. Whether or not you have a joint air-ground integration cell, somebody's got to look at employing joint capabilities between air and ground. So if you don't want to call it a JADGET, you still have to do joint air-ground integration. And so it's worth keeping that in mind. Don't know, again, and we'll talk this with the CP design looks like with that. But these things right here kind of lay out in doctrine what the most current directives are. Anyone have any questions, comments on this? Go ahead.
So that, the reason they're not taking a JADGET when we're talking about is because they're defining what they're planning to take.
Yeah.
But with that, this kind of labels it in a box for effectively what a division should look like. And in all reality, what we're still doing is what we used to do before PCPs, narrow division and task forces, where you would have different slices of a division that you needed to surge out. Like when I went to Iraq and on the side, it was a surge where it was infantry group, some engineers, some intel. It was just you had different packages. So is that more in the way of what we're falling back to again, or do you think that this is really kind of boxing in the concept of a division core responsibility?
I would call it boxing. What it's really doing here, it's a great question, right? But what it's really doing is just laying out, it's not saying how you have to do all these things, right? It's just saying these are things that a division has got to be able to do. If you neck it down and look at like the brigade level, right? A brigade still has, organic to a BCT, right? I'm gonna talk from what I know. A BCT still has organic fires battalion, right? So inherent in a brigade, like any brigade, pick it, whatever you call it, a BCT has a responsibility to manage the fires picture and fight the brigade deep fight, right? While simultaneously allowing infantry battalions and maneuver battalions to do that, right?
But in the absence of, would you rely on your high responsibility acts that you weren't allowed to employ those?
Sure, and as Colonel Manner said, part of what you've got to do as a commander at the brigade level and at the division level, right, is request those resources and leverage that stuff for things that either you're out of Schlitz to Schlitz being the formal doctrinal term, right? If you're out of Schlitz for that, like you don't have, and then you've got to leverage those other assets, right? Or to a point we talked about yesterday, hey, if I'm out of Schlitz, I got to go back and address that risk, right? Because no matter what echelon, commanders still have that responsibility to identify and address that risk. And so even at the divisional level, if the corps commander says, hey, I need you to do that, Roger said, we can do that, but here's the risk associated with that. That means I can't do this other thing you told me to do. Or I can do that, but that means I'll have to delay this operation because I'm going to use combat power towards that. Sorry. So again, I don't want to get wrapped around the eaches and ands. This is a framework to talk about what the broad responsibilities are for this. Great question, though. Any other questions? Did you get your hand back there? No? Okay. One thing on here too, this is conduct shaping operations in Division AO. So one of the things that's kind of inherent with that, and again, I want to tie it back to what the previous doctor said too. So when you talk about shaping operations, one of the most important things the division will do is set those conditions for during periods of transition, right? And that's part of what the deep fight is. It's very important for us to recognize, and for OCTs to recognize, when the division commander is talking about the deep fight is not only in terms of geographical deep fight, like what's going on, thinking over the next 2-3 days. Over the next 2-3 days, the critical thing is also managing those transitions. I mean, who here has been to NTC, where the next phase of the fight, and all of a sudden you've got 2 platoons of combat power ripped away from you, right? You know what I'm saying? Those task board change, and inevitably that task board changes happens at like 2100 when people are trying to get vehicle maintenance and crew rest out there, right? And so now you're like in the middle of the night trying to drive to a different AO, right? Because those task force changes. Managing transition. Now imagine that at a battalion level. You know, correction, at a divisional level, where battalions are being told to move and task forward. Part of that's all about managing those transitions. And so when the division's looking deep, that's a part of that. It's not just the fires, it's also the task organization and the placement of maneuver units and sustainment and the other enabled units across the board as well. Those are all requisite things for transition too. Just keep in mind. So, next question. So real quick, this is not doctrine, but next slide. Just helpful here. This is a picture where we currently stand with regard to the division headquarters. We've got 11 active duty divisions, as depicted here. We've got 8 National Guard divisions and 2 reserve division headquarters, right? So what does that mean, particularly for this audience? Well, 48% of the Army Division Headquarters is a First Army responsibility. Y'all have fun with that, you good? Right. No? So that's part of what's generating this conversation here. Is like, look, First Army has an incredibly important role to train and prepare those divisions. And as we talked about yesterday, look, I understand you have 20 to 39 days of training available, period, in a year to do all those things the division is supposed to do. So you guys have a distinctly harder problem set that you've got to look at. But that's kind of what it stands right now. It's helpful to help frame the scope of the problem. Next slide. So going back to your question, Captain, was it Brookheel? All right, my bad. Hey, so these are some of the toys. So yesterday I talked about toys. Toys are also obviously non-doctrinal, but it's a helpful way to think about that. Like, what assets does the division have to play with? Well, this is what it could look like. You're talking between 2 to 5 BCTs, what we think of as, brigade combat units, plus the additional enablers across the board. So you've got the sustainment brigade, DIVRE, and an ECAB, cab or ECAB on there. Right? So those are all assets that the division headquarters has got a responsibility to integrate. On top of that, you've got all these other rando forces right here. Rando, again, also a non-doctrinal term. But my point is, like, you've got all these different assets, all these flavors of thing, right? So what happens when you get assets? Go ahead. People don't know what to do with them. Has that ever happened to you? Just in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, I did like a squadron level, but.
Yeah. So what's your experience? Go ahead.
It happens all the time in divisions, you know what I mean? Like, we mentioned it with the Air Force people. We get people that show up in a SAC P or D name. You're like, what do you do? Where are you coming from? And you're not quite sure what it is. Or you hear a report of, hey, this unit conducted a link up with the brigade. And they have no idea what the capabilities are and where to employ them, who they report to.
Right.
Those things. And it can be turned into mass chaos if you don't know how to use them or where they need to go.
Absolutely. I mean, it's spot on. I think we've all experienced this in some degree at a battalion or brigade level. And, you get these random people attached to you. You're like, hey, what do you do here? Like, how are you supposed to help me? And you don't know if they're there to help augment. I mean, ostensibly they're all there to help augment your combat power, but your ability to bring them into the plan, right, is mitigated by their ability to communicate what they can do, and kind of sometimes the initiative level, the attackments have for you as well, right? Now imagine that across the board with not only, this is 2 to 5 here, plus you got these other brigades here, so you could potentially be looking at 9 separate brigades, as many as well as these other separate forces here, right? Separate battalions that are attached to them as well, right? That's just a lot of things, and span of control becomes somewhat of a problem set as you look at that. And not only span of control, but your ability to integrate things, right? If you look back on slide 6, I don't need you to turn there, but on slide 6, it talks about the division responsibilities, maximizing combat power at decisive points, right? This is all combat power. It might not shoot bullets, but those are the other enablers that allow us to achieve that combined arms effect that we're looking for at that decisive place in time, right? Any armor folks here? Okay, oh, that's right, yeah, right? So it's right, you know what that is, right? right? It's that symphony of destruction that you're trying to do when you conduct and deliver a breach, right? So you've got smoke, you've got artillery, you've got obscuration, you've got all this other stuff that's going down, so that you can get there and breach the obstacle belt, right? Drive through there, penetrate, and then continue operation on the other side. But it requires that synchronization, getting all those things at the right place, right time, right? Now imagine doing that with all those other assets. How are we looking at mitigating enemy air defense artillery so I can fly my aviation? Part of it becomes that chess game. Where do I put things? What am I doing to destroy the enemy ADA capacity, or if not destroy, neutralize some of the PW assets and other things we have, right? Putting that, synchronizing that in time and space so that I can use the assets that I have to destroy the enemy in front of me and fight that demon fight. The reason I say this becomes an incredibly complex problem set. That division headquarters, and that's why they have 2-star in charge. Because that's what those GOs get paid to do. All right, so we'll talk next about, so that's a little bit about the design of the organization. Any questions on this? Go ahead.
Let me just add, right now, maneuver enhancement brigades or MEBs, there are no active component MEBs, but on the reserve side is where those MEBs exist. With the Waypoint 2028 in our rearm strategy for how the Army's transforming and modernizing, those MEBs will become protection brigades, and there's going to be MP brigade headquarters and engineer brigade headquarters that serve as bill payers to stand up 2 active duty penetration brigades that'll be assigned. I'm sorry, I think it's 4. It's four penetration brigades that'll be assigned to 2 of the penetration divisions. So we're going to talk a little bit about it, but just so when you see that MEB, that second icon over to the right of the engineer brigade, that's kind of the way that the Army is going with transformation. So as you hear those terms, MEB and protection brigade, that kind of those 2 will effectively at some point become synonymous.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. Having the subject matter experts, on the staff that know what the capabilities of those organizations are and able to integrate that into the plan is certainly helpful on that. Any other questions, comments? Okay. Drive on. Hey, so we're now going to transition to talk about some of the things, again, that slide was an overview of some of the things we expect to see in the divisions. Divisions have an HHBN, right? For the most part, that's not really touched on during warfighters and CBXs. But in doctrine, there's some things that are particularly pertinent to everyone here, right? So HHBN are responsible, they've got 4 primary duties: administrative, life support, communications, and transportation responsibility. The reason I highlight that is because, and you see that right up here, transportation responsibility, right? Those are those 4 things. So admin, it's like your HHCs, right? Make sure everyone's done a PT test, do height and weight, do awards and evals are straight, right? Life support, that becomes a little bit different. Like, hey, how are they sustaining themselves? That HHBN is a headquarters node responsible for that, right? Part of that life support there, part of that sustainment responsibility comes back down to equipment readiness. And that was something that we talked about a lot yesterday, right? So the HHBN has a responsibility to track and maintain the equipment readiness of the division's equipment in conjunction with whoever the equipment owner is, right? So if there's a satellite truck broken in the division headquarters, whose responsibility is it? Anyone want to venture a guess? There's multiple right answers. Go ahead.
XOs.
Okay, yeah, HHBN XO. Yeah, sure. I mean, that's the joy of being XO. You are responsible for that maintenance, right?
Well, everything.
Sure. So the G6 has a responsibility to maintain their equipment because they got to make sure it gets used, right? The HHBN XO has a responsibility to make sure that. They've got a company commander who's got to make sure that stuff's working too. So the point is, as for you guys, as you're looking to do pre-mobilization partnership, your ability to kind of wrap your hands around the HHBN leadership as well is particularly important as you're looking at equipment readiness specifically. Go ahead.
So just throwing it out there, so transportation maintenance. So everybody sees it, kind of gets back to what Captain Purdue was saying. On the sustainment side, they pulled capacity out of what used to be the brigades, so they pulled it out of your BSBs to put it in the CSSBs. So now they have the capacity to support a division. But when the division headquarters moves at the same time as some of those BCTs, you end up with some severely constrained assets. So division headquarters doesn't have any organic assets to move themselves, so the CSSB is picking that up, or the DSSB is picking that up. But now the DSSB can't carry all the secondary and tertiary loads that the BCT is required to push, which becomes a massive problem when it comes to utilization of trucks or any movement asset for that matter.
Yeah. Look, we were just with an active duty division, and I was talking with their G3 Sergeant Major. Because one of the things, and we'll talk about this further in the CP displacement breakout, they didn't have enough seats to move everybody in the vehicle. So they couldn't move their TOC, their division main, in one lift. That becomes problematic. Like, who are we leaving back? You know, what if it's an 8-hour turn between different jump sites? Now we're talking, 16 hours at a minimum, just there and back. You're not talking upload, download times, right? This becomes problematic. And so the other thing I bring up, you may not see this problem set with regard to specifically for the 28 by D for CPX3, right? This is probably outside the scope of this. But the same principle applies to the brigades that got to jump their TOCs, right? Or their CPs, sorry, bad enough. And the same thing, so the similar problem set you find, it is pertinent to what we do, what y'all do in First Army, what we do as OCTs to help identify some of those gaps, as you just pointed out. Sir.
So it is a FORSCOM business rule that they move their CP once. Everybody understand? So one time the division should be moving their division TOC. And it goes to each one of the nodes, right? So the TOC should displace once, the TAC, if it hasn't, should displace once, and the rear area command post should displace once. Make sense? So start priming the pump. He alluded to it. They don't realize how much stuff it takes to move it. Of course, the operations sergeant major does, you know what I mean? And other folks know, and he's told people, but until they start to muscle through it, and it is an operation, right? I mean, it is a major undertaking. And how much stuff do they have? And then some of the air beam tents, what do you have to load them with? A forklift, right? You can't pick that thing up. So you need a 10K rough terrain or something to pick that thing up. You see the second, third order effects, they won't think through that because they just set it up, take it down. We have habitually not seen I've only seen 2 units during the CPX3 move their CP. Okay, that includes active duty, compo 2, that's everyone. So when they get to the warfighter, and they knew this rule was coming, but it's kind of like they don't want to acknowledge it. I mean, the planners, you know what I mean? The kids, they're like, oh, well, they won't make us do that. It's raining, or whatever else is going on. So just something to think about. Make sure with the 28 you prime their pump, and just tell them, hey, you guys realize you got to jump this TOC Mahal once. You know what I mean? And what some units do, ATTP, is they'll make it a little bit smaller when they jump it. You know what I mean? And what they'll do too is they'll split out, if they're gonna jump, what they'll do is they'll split out the TAC, of course, because the TAC has to go somewhere and take the fight, or somebody has to take the fight, whether it's the Davardi, I mean, you'll see just all different iterations of things, which is absolutely fine, but they gotta work through that and think about it. Okay? Questions? Yeah.
I'm more familiar with time talks in regards to their setups, but in regards to a division talk, what is the whole timeline from unpack to fully set up? You got your red, all you have to green. Like, how long does that usually take for them?
Understand your question. A generic estimate is anywhere without travel time, okay? So travel time is the wild card. So you figure whatever the travel time to the other location is going to be, cross terrain, everything else, are you going on a road, are you going off-road, all that. But just to break it all down and then reset it up somewhere is probably like a 6 to 8 hour operation. And it could be more if they haven't done it. If they've never done it and they don't have their stuff color-coded, and they don't have their boxes color-coded, or some of you might remember this little game we used to play where you color-coded stuff and stuff always went in the same box. I've watched kids just start grabbing boxes and start trying to fill them. You know what I mean? Again, nobody's doing anything with ill intent. They're trying to get the mission done and they haven't thought through it. So, you know, that wild card, like, you know, down from 6 hours to maybe 5, because we're not really, you know what I mean? You'll see good units will pre-stage the boxes and use the boxes in the layout plan of how they're doing stuff. You know what I mean? And then there's just multiple TTPs, but it takes a while. It takes a hot minute. And then if you add in, they don't have enough organic assets to move it. So they've got to pull assets from the lower echelons to be able to move it. If they have a striker unit attached to them, right? What does a striker unit have? A lot of trucks. It's got more trucks than you have drivers. I mean, if everybody's in a striker driving around, nobody can move all those trucks. So, I mean, there's different places to harvest stuff from, but you have to think it through. You can't just get on the radio and everybody send me 5 trucks. You can, it's a technique. If you wait till the last minute, it only takes a minute, right? Okay.
We'll touch on some more of those questions specifically in the breakout this afternoon for CPs and CP displacement. This is meant to give an overview across the board.
Sure, can I pull the cheat code in here? I'm very familiar with CSSBs and DSSBs. Underutilized asset and cheat code right there is to get after that composite transportation company. They have 40 MTVs with trailer by MTO. Issue is going to be, of course, operators, because you still have 40 either PLS or LHSs. 274 sold the company. So they're going to be stretched very, very thin, but that's exactly what those MTVs are for. Really, it's for IBCT is to move troops, but I mean for that division headquarters and moving that, most of those people can drive MTV equipment. It's not a specialized piece of equipment. So just getting out there, looking at divisions, if they're not utilizing that CTC to move with MTVs, they're missing the mark.
So just throw the wild card of we're moving at night in there. You know what I mean? I mean, just the second, I mean, you guys have all done stuff, right? You've all moved stuff, you've all packed stuff up. I mean, just, you gotta be the devil's advocate in some of this stuff when they're planning, and just bring it up. Say, are all your guys not qualified? Did you do night driving? Or when was the last time, because the last thing you want is to like roll on TV.
Sure. No, the main takeaway from this, and again, we can deep dive this a little bit further in the breakout this afternoon. The main point of this is that it's a deliberate action. You can't just like throw this and be like, hey, we're going to throw some stuff in the truck and drive on. No, man. Like, you've got to have it deliberately planned, deliberately, resourced, rehearsed, and synchronized with other assets to make sure you're not pulling things from everyone else. That, hey, the division main CP move is a big deal, but, the division breaching operation may also be a pretty big deal. So you just got to make sure it's synchronized with resources and in time. Okay? We'll move on to the next slide. So this is an overview, and I'll give you a chance to kind of read through there if you want to. Again, this is just cut and pasting from FM 394, Chapter 5. But the key highlight here is you got 3 real command posts, and then 2 other kind of groups, if you will. So at a division organization, you will find the big 3. You got the main CP, the division TAC, the tactical CP, and the rear command post. And we'll spend the majority of the rest of this brief talking about what those are, what they look like, what they're composed of, generally comprised of, and what kind of leadership is in each of those. The mobile commander, very briefly, is just wherever the CG goes. So that might be what you would think of as like a battalion TAC, like 2 vehicles and the 2 and the 3. Well, just take that at the CG level, and wherever the CG goes, he's a C2 node. Like, he gets to make those decisions. That's what he gets paid to do. And then early entry command posts may be used in certain specific instances. We're not going to really touch on that too much in this brief, but it's probably outside the scope of what 20th ID is going to use well, right? But in doctrine, those are the kind of the big 5 there. And we're going to go on each one of those with the next slide. So you saw this chart here yesterday. I want to park here a little bit and kind of talk and just reopen it up if anyone's got questions. But no matter what you're doing, when you look at what a command post is supposed to do, and frankly, this applies to any echelon command post. So your company CP, your battalion CPs, you've got your battalion ALOCs, right? Any of one of those nodes, people are going to be making decisions either there. You got to think through like what the scope is, right? So what are they responsible for? You got to look at the mission sets. You know, what problems are those guys supposed to be solving, guys and gals? And then who do we need to have there? And it's important, those kind of three questions, right? So what are their responsibilities? What problems do they have to solve? And then who do we need there in terms of warfighting function capability? When you put those three together, you get an overall understanding of what that CP is supposed to be structured and what they're supposed to function and do, right? So we talked about a couple considerations here, right? And it's worth noting that when you talk about battlefield geometry, this is one of those things you will see. How far away do you have to be effective at providing command control, right? In some instances, and you see this in warfighters, it goes back to kind of CP displacement, you will see hundreds of kilometers. I've seen one where the main was 120 kilometers away from the fight. That's probably a bit too far. You're outside of effective comms range for a lot of your comms windows. You're not able to use all the comm systems you have, and there's just a lag between understanding. And frankly, if the CG needs to get forward a little bit, there's a literal timeline. That may take them a few hours to get out to the front lines. So those are all things considered. Battlefield geometry. We talked a little bit about that with the slide that we showed yesterday that showed the distances between CPs and what the deep close fight is, right? We have that as a backup if you want to revisit that at all. But it's helpful to understand between those frameworks. And what I will say in battlefield geometry too is there's that framework, right? The deep, close, and rear. When you go back to those big three CPs, you've got the TAC, you've got the main, and you've got the rear. So there's a logic to some of those things and who's fighting what, who's looking at what. You got three problem sets, you got three CPs. There's a helpful way to think about that. Any questions on that? With the manning piece, you got to look at, and so to your point, I know we talked about with the JAGIC, the decision to kind of stand the JAGIC down. And part of it is you got to fight with what you got, right? Totally understand, not trying to throw stones at all, right? You can only man, like if you only have 20 dudes, that's how many guys you got here, right? Those are the soldiers you have available to solve the problem. So you got to look at that manning and use what you have available. But the problem is you still have the responsibility to do these functions. Irrespective of what your manning level is, those guys got to get guys and gals got to get cross-trained across the board to be able to solve those problem sets, right? Okay. Barring any questions here, again, you kind of saw it yesterday. I wanted to briefly recap this. Okay. Main CP. So this is the busiest place. This is the busiest place you've got out there. And we talked about some considerations here. I want to read them, right? Can you pull up slide 6 on the left screen? Slide 6, you've got these responsibilities here, right? Going back to what we talked about in Doc. This is where a lot of that's going to happen right here, is in the CP, right? So the CP, when you look at those responsibilities, employing joint capabilities and shaping operations for the division D fight, talk about synchronizing efforts to mass effects. All those things are going to be done primarily in the main CP. That's where you're going to do that, right? Go ahead and move on to 13. So the main CP, so let me break it down for you guys. It's going to look like 2 big tents with a whole bunch of other ants. So when you think of like a brigade talks you may have seen, right? Those large trashes, or someone uses their, I don't care about the tent architecture itself, nobody cares about that. But you're going to have 2 giant ass tents with a whole bunch of little other ones around it, okay? And those tents are going to cover down a couple different functions. You're going to have the G2 section will be at the main. G6 will typically be at the main. You're going to have the planning, so the G3, G35 section that's integrated across the board. That's also the D main, right? You've got one small tent that's going to be the command suite, So think this is where all the aids are, this is SGS may or may not be, and the GOs and the chief will have a tent for themselves as well. And typically the CG gets his or her own tent after that. One of the large tents that you'll see is typically an integration cell. So you'll have slice elements from different units, and that's going to be your other enablers, probably a logistics and a medical representative. Most of the logging folks will be in the rear, but you're going to want to have those people cross-level. You want some logging folks up front, some protection folks up front as well in that integration cell. So that's where I've seen, and every division is going to do it different. But typically you see one of those huge tents dedicated to, IO, maybe maybe lawyers like that, where those people are. Some of the special staff, some of that, in that one of those other tents. And then the other large tent would be the COIC floor. So let's move on. Yeah, thank you. Perfect. On the COIC floor, this is an example of what this looks like, a COIC floor would look like. Now, you talk about the D main being a busy place. The COIC floor is the busiest place of the busy place. Okay? On the COIC floor, you've got the jacket right here. So this is 100% what that is meant to be, that cell that integrates that air and ground and the joint capabilities inherent to the division. You'll have the G2 CUOPS and G3 CUOPS. This is where your battle major, your chops. This is where they're receiving information. Depending how you set it up, you may have, there's different ways to set it up. I've seen one where you kind of walk in here and you've got the screens at one end, or you got the screens set up here and everyone's kind of stadium seating around that. Ergonomics do matter. Your ability to get up, walk around and talk to people and cross-level information, it does matter. It's always a comment that we talk about in just about every war. I mean, James, you sat through far more warfighters than I have. But I know main CP ergonomics comes up time and time again, right? Every time, right? So this wherever you put the screens themselves, that becomes the division cop. That's supposed to be a central place that you're supposed to look at and be able to receive information quickly. Okay? And then also worth noting, your LNOs have got to sit somewhere on the D main as well, typically in the code floor as well. And your LNOs are those brigade reps that are sent to represent that brigade, answer questions from the division immediately, and then provide that conduit back and forth across. The leaders you will typically see in the COIC floor will be the G33, the chops, right? So he or she will be that lead major kind of running the show back there. Their job is not to fight the fight and take reports. They've got battle captains and RTOs for that. Their job is to step back and orchestrate that symphony and figure out, are all the pieces moving in what we're supposed to be doing, in the next, from now to like 6 hours from now, right? Typically the G3 has a seat out there, and the G3 may or may not work out there as well. I've also seen the cost with the chief of staff with a seat out on the code floor, although I've rarely seen the chief out there, so I don't know if you've experienced that from what you've seen.
It's a mix. I've never seen one sit actually out there, because who has the fight, right? If the G3 is sitting there, do we need the chief of staff sitting there too?
Exactly.
But usually the chief of staff is sitting in that command group area. One of the things that's not on here that I recommend, and we'll add it to this, that I recommend the unit does is put the ACE, right? What's the ACE? Somebody say it. I heard it. Okay, so, thank you. So the ACE directly off this. People will be resistant. Well, they need to have a separate space on. Yeah, it's called the gerbil tube. You know what I mean? The little thing that connects the tent to the big tent. But if they put the ACE right there, then people can get up and interface with the folks that sit in the front of the ACE. And I recommend they break the ACE into two sections. You have, we're doing the super secret, stuff back behind this little partition. And out front, you have the kids that could answer the questions that they would come and ask. Because if it's not, then somebody has to walk out, and it's always in a tent set up like right outside, but it's not connected. So having done this for 3 years, that is probably a good TTP. Again, it's one of those things you bring up, they'll learn it the hard way if they don't.
But it's really hard, to Colonel Manner's point, it's hard to integrate things if you have to walk out of your tent, walk into another tent. Just the physical design, it does matter, folks. And so there should be an inherent logic that drives it, right? If you just got separate tents set up because it's easier for the setup, well, maybe that's part of the reasoning behind that. Separate tents make it easier to jump and tear down. Fair. But if separate tents mean that you don't have the ability to interact with people, well, then you may not be fulfilling the whole purpose of the command post, which is to provide that shared understanding and synchronization. Any questions on the COIC or the D main? Anyone ever see one?
It's a mythical beast.
It's a mythical beast. What was your take on it? Was it organized well, not organized well? What was your kind of experience of that?
It goes through a continual refinement process based on, what stage the division staff is in, how mature the division staff is,
Okay.
and then what level of exercise they're preparing for. So, the first time you take it all out and set it up behind the division headquarters, it looks one way. And then the next time you get it out into the field, the chief has said, that didn't work, I want it to look this way. And then by the time the O and the CG do their walkthroughs, and then 2 other tents move in a different direction, so.
Yeah.
But it's, yeah.
No, and that's a great point. It brings up something, I'm glad you kind of mentioned that, because for OCTs, look, one of the things we do, and I know y'all do it too when you get a new unit, you look at their SOPs. That's one of the first things you got to look at, right? Well, hey, I'm a C2 nerd, it's kind of what I do, so I look at the SOPs they have established to set up and tear down their tents and how they have that design. And, are they adhering to their SOPs themselves? Or if they're making deliberate decisions to break from those SOPs, okay, that's fine. Have you recaptured and refined your SOPs? Those are specific things you guys, OCTs, ranking material, can look at and be like, hey, your SOP says this, you made a deviation from that. Was that deliberate or not? Asking that simple question, was that deliberate or not, it will help drive, it will be like, oh yeah, we should probably, it'll either drive them to refine their SOP or go back to adhering to their SOP because that was a whoopsie. All right, so the next topic we'll talk about is the DTAC, right, division TAC. Excellent.
Perfect.
Go ahead.
Can you just give us a sense of, I have not seen a tent version of a D-main. Give us a sense of, the size of this footprint.
So 500 by 500. So it's you're talking 8 grid square, potentially up there. You want to keep it as small as possible for tactical reasons, right? Like no one wants to get killed. And just the larger footprint you have, the harder it is to set up, tear down, and survivability becomes a problem. But easily you're looking at about 500 meters by 500 meters, total space. Something like maybe 3/4 of this room could be one of the big tents on a division main. Or maybe half this room might be a big tent size. So if you took this room, split it in half, one would be the COIC floor and one would be the integrated cell. That might be a little bit on the big side, but in terms of space, this is probably about what you'd expect.
So in OAF1, the 101st D main, it was about the size of this room, the COIC, exactly like what we said. Just the COIC and the integrated cells.
Okay. Any other questions? Great question. Appreciate it. Go ahead.
So one thing that's not typically doctrine, but one thing that we learned, especially in the 101st, whenever I was in the G staff, as well as whenever I was in one of the brigades, is those not doctrine. What we ended up doing was establishing the G6 or the S6 main communications tent, and everything was built off of that. Because that, by the time that node was established, the site was established, and then everyone got that set. Whenever everyone else came online, we were handing them wires.
Absolutely.
So it was one of those non-doctrinal but best practices that, especially at the 101st area, we were jumping all across, everywhere. It made for the best life because otherwise, you set up the main tents or you set up whatever you feel is most important at that moment, and then everyone's staring at you going, what am I doing now? What am I doing?
And so again, when we talk about CP setup, CP display, again, I want to push that to the breakout and the discussion we'll have later this afternoon. The whole point is to give you an understanding of the scope of the organization. Big organization, big tents, lots of moving parts, lots of integrated stuff. Fair? Good.
So I do want to make one point because he talked earlier about manning, organization of the CPs, and this is more we'll call this a professional development kind of a thing. So one, as an OCT, if you walk into a CP, whether that be battalion, brigade, or division, and you sense or see a lack of organization and a lack of thought to how they set up, that's an indicator right there, and that should cue you in to start digging. For you NCOs that may one day be ops NCOICs, ops sergeant majors at battalion, brigade, division, the first thing that you should look at is how well your CP is organized once it gets set up. Because then you can start digging, because you know right off the bat they're not doing something right, and then you can help to improve that particular piece of it. Same for battle captains, S3s, whether it be battalion, brigade, so on and so forth, or G3s. So it's a good indicator. It might, if they're well organized, I won't say it makes life easy. They're still going to have problems. They're still going to struggle. But not the same problems if they haven't even thought about the setup, the architecture of their CP, and how it relates to their purpose, reason for being. If the COIC is in charge of the current fight, the close fight, then they ought to have the people that can see, analyze, and not necessarily directly control, but help to shape and push information out to the folks that are shaping for that current fight, if that makes sense.
All right, so real quickly, because we'll talk about the TAC for a little bit too, right? So when we talk about division TAC, that in terms of physical space and geometry, keep pulling that thread, right? It's going to look a lot like a battalion TOC size element, you know? Like that's what you should look at that. I think it's vehicles with probably a medium trash. It's got a column in the middle, and it's run. You know, you've got some battle majors and stuff there. The leader for that, the leadership you'll see typically at attack will be the DCGO, right? So the general in charge of operations and maneuver. And you may see the G3 augment that as well. It all depends on the flavor of the organization. It's hard to say with them. We'll talk about some of the specific things in here, but when you talk about manning the TAC, look, on the division, MTEC, they have these slots that are coded against them. But a lot of times, it comes down to fighter management and talent management too, right? Because the same chops that's running, yesterday you heard Colonel Johnson talk about his experiences as Adjutant Chief, pulling a 16-hour shift, crashing for 4 hours, drinking a monster, getting up and doing it all over again, right? Red Bull didn't just give him wings there. So the point is, like, you've got to have someone's got to be looking at fighter management too, making sure you've got the ability to do this, because you could do anything. There's a lot of stuff you can probably do for 4 or 5 days straight, right? You power through CPX, particularly at a 12-hour shift. When the lights shut off after 12 hours. But when you're doing this over a long, and this is one of those things you really got to look at. And I say it's in terms of manning considerations for the TAC. But it's really manning considerations writ large to the division headquarters. That fighter management piece of understanding who's got that, so you can do that for that year-long mission set, what that division's going to be doing. It's helpful, for you to keep in mind as you look at CPX. On the next chart, so this is in doctrine. It lays out some of the responsibilities. I'm not going to read it for you, but what I will highlight are some of the distinct responsibilities that TAC is supposed to be. A TAC is not the main. It's not going to have the same capabilities as a D main, right? So you just got to break the mentality of that. What it is designed to do is control specific operations. So if you've got very specific discrete operations, when it says discrete in doctrine, it talks about a 48-hour window. So your TAC should be running on about a 48-hour clock, right? After that, you need some significant sustainment augmentation to continue sustaining longer. It happens. But it's designed for those to control those discrete operations, like a brigade wet gap crossing, which we'll talk about later this morning, right? Brigade level air assaults, maybe managing the transition specifically to defense or passage of lines. Those are some of the things in doctrine that, hey, these are examples of those delivered operations. As Colonel Manor pointed out, if you're going to jump the main, a lot of times it can be the TAC in doctrine can be used as a prepositioning. So you send your TAC out. That takes control of the fight for a discrete amount of time. And then the main catches back up, and then you kind of expand from there, right? Logically, it makes sense, but that's another way you can use it. One thing that I found interesting as I was kind of reviewing and preparing for this is that you can use the TAC as a designated headquarters for multi-brigade task forces. The example of doctrine that they use is, let's say you're doing a division attack and you're moving forward, right? Well, in an attack, you're going to have bypass criteria, meaning that, hey, if I'm saying I will allow bypass of platoon-sized elements or more, right? Or platoon-sized elements or less. That's still an enemy platoon out there capable of doing bad things to you and your sustainment, you know? So what you could use that for is, while the division main is focused on the main attack, the division attack can focus on a multi-brigade task force to hunt down those bypass units and destroy them as well. Does that make sense? So you get 2 simultaneous headquarter responsibilities as well, one with the CG and one with the DCG. Any questions on that?
So
Sir?
you kind of talked about the things that we can do with the TAC, but there's a purpose for extending your command and control. Well, I kind of teased it out there. One, having a separate node allows you to extend your command and control and do multiple things at once. But the other thing, if I think in terms of offensive operations, it allows me to maintain tempo. But it kind of goes back to what he said earlier. I've got to be deliberate and I have to plan for those transitions. Because somebody's got to be in charge of the fight. And if you don't time it right, or if you take 16 hours to jump your main instead of 7, 8, 9 hours, then there's some risk associated with that. I've either got to man or augment the ACP, the TAC, so that it can extend a little bit farther, or command may devolve into something else. You may have a period of time. There's your real risk, because nobody's controlling the fight at any given time. So just kind of think of that. It's the same as if one of your command posts is killed. It also makes it more survivable, by the way.
Sir. And typically between the main, which is the biggest footprint, the TAC has the smallest footprint. And next slide. The rear CP has kind of medium footprint. So when you think of like a D main or a D TAC, you think like a battalion-sized TOC, element with a medium drash or something of that equivalent size, right? The rear CP is going to be a little bit bigger. It's in the rear, so it's a little more secure. You're not as concerned about survivability, and so you want to talk about capacity at that point, right? Because the trade-off between expeditionary, keeping it small, means you don't have as much capacity to do stuff as well, right? And so the rear CP logically is going to be a little bit bigger. You might think of that as like a battalion plus TOC, like a larger battalion TOC, or even maybe a small brigade-sized TOC for the rear CP. Typically, the people you will see back in the division staff will be your sustainers and your protection cell. Because in the rear, the med commander typically defaults as a battle space owner for the division rear area. So you've got a brigade commander in charge of the rear area, which is the med commander. The rear CP is not, it should not be a battle space owner, right? But it has a responsibility to manage all sustainment functions and protection functions across the board. The leader that you will typically see there, if you've got the CG in the main, and you've got the O in the TAC, well then the other general officer, the DCGS for sustainment, is logically the person you would see in the rear CP. A couple of things to look at there. Just like we talked about in the main, you got to have a G4 and kind of med rep in the main. You want to have a movement maneuver, represented in the RCP as well. So you got to cross-level that talent across the board. So if you're in the rear CP, you see the divisions not thinking about putting maneuverists back there, you're going to lose that connectivity and touch point there. Part of what they're going to look at, and the rear CP's responsibility is controlling the movement of convoy forces and things like that. Having that maneuver officer there will help provide that skill set that may be missing across the board in some of the other organizations there. Next chart. Again, that just hits on some of those things. The other thing that will be in the rear CP that they'll have responsibilities for is typically the medical coverage for the division as well. So you've got the division support area, which will be ran by the sustainment brigade. You've got the MEB as a battle space owner, but there's also that medical capacity in there.
Where do some of the core assets park with that question? So things like the area support medical company, medical brigade, MP brigade headquarters, things that might not necessarily be back with the core headquarters, but maybe forward.
They may, sir. And at the risk of not trying to sound trite, a lot of that is MED-TC dependent. So there are things that just based on the conditions out there, those decisions will be made. Typically, the core rear area will be forward of the divisional rear area. may be some bleed over in that, and I would defer to Dave on some of that. Colonel Peters is our sustainment here, who may have a better answer than some of that.
You're talking about medical coverage in the division support area? and core support assets. Yeah, in the core, yeah, I mean, you have the roll 3 back at the core support area, but for the division support area with the division and all its enablers and all its asset, there's got to be another roll 2 capability for just all the tenant units that are in the division support area. If you look at the DSA, it could be 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers, you know, width and height there. So it's additional core assets that push down to the division usually to cover those units that are just there operating.
And I mentioned this the same to them, that GSO really, GS reinforcing assets that the Corps controls, and the divisions account for that before the warfighter, because even as a brigade division, a lot of times will impose its will on the brigade headquarters and give it things and responsibility for things. Same with the division and the Corps. And I would imagine that the rear CP would be the ones that would have oversight responsibility for a lot of that.
At least visibility, certainly, sir, and to the degree that the relationship has been established for that, yes. I mean, the rear CPU, everyone can imagine that. And you know, the DCGS being back there as representative of the commander is probably the most appropriate person to kind of deal geo to geo with core assets. I'll defer to any of my other OCTs. I certainly want to speak outside of my area of expertise in that.
The problem will become the tyranny of distance, right? Because when they set up the core or the rear area command posts, and everybody is pushing forward, eventually they're going to have to jump that thing forward, or they're too far behind. And they will. Historically, divisions are resistant to jump that. You know what I mean? But how far back can it be? You know what I mean? And it's another one of those METC things, but if things get too far back, you're just increasing your locks. You're increasing, I mean, you know, and then what's going to happen as everybody moves forward with the division? Who's going to move into that space, right? So all that has to be taken into account. So it's just one more thing that they need to plan for and think about.
Go ahead.
So the other thing about, I mean, everything's a weighted effort and everything's an opportunity cost, but so typically the problems that the commander just talked about, so it's going to take, 2 to 3 days or whatever it is to jump the GSA. And part of the problem, the big disconnect within the plans and operations section with both BUOPs and plans, depending on who's running what time horizon, is that the rear CP, if they don't actively participate in some of the planning, or if they're not given one of the planners, then their movement table as far as what it's going to take for them to displace and start moving forward so that the lines don't get super far will then fall off. And then the synchronization within the DSP, within the movement of, like both them and some of the other sustainment, as well as all, the other assets that are in the DSA will not get synchronized. So then the main will think that they're on plan moving forward. And then in the back, the RCP is trying to get everything going. And then the other big distinction with the RCP is that, because it's an economy of force mission, most of the time what you see is the MED comes in and then it's negotiation with the DCGS on what division puts over top. So depending on if you're MED, that's why if you're like for me, for one of the warfighters, I was assigned to the rear command post support the MED. Part of it, as soon as you get there, you want to see hey, you have all your planners, what, fires people, because it's usually the planners and fires that, division needs to provide, as well as whatever key staff ES needs. But they also have to manage the theater combat force, or essentially that maneuver element that's going to help secure that rear element, like the rear area. Now, with that, you need intelligence, right? So then the ACE wants to keep all their intel people. The MED's usually short on intel people. So across all the warfighting functions, it's easy to get focused forward and up. But if you want to lose all your supplies and everything, be 100% focused as an OCT forward, and then not tying in some of the lessons learned. And for us, the OCTs, you're always looking at hey, what's going? For me, a maneuver guy, I'm talking to the maneuver guys. Maybe it's Colonel Peters guys with the rear CP and saying hey, how's it looking back there? What do I need to tell the chops? Or whoever looking forward that they're not seen in the rear. So that way you can support the rear command post people also. You can say like, hey, you know, planners, hey, are you guys looking at, you know, are you ladies looking at jumping, you know, the DSA forward?
And you know, one quick vignette here. So the reason we talk about that, and the reason we talk about the need to synchronize this, is it comes back to timing and making sure it's nested in the plan. I was at a warfighter, and they were briefing their plan to jump the division's rear area, right? They talked about that, and it was going to be overlaid on top of when they're doing a division main attack. So they've got 2 brigades attacking a defensive position at the same time when the rear is moving forward. When the rear is moving forward, their plan is to jump all of their medical assets for the division at the same time as they're doing a major assault. The DCGO, he was able to step back, look at that during the ops and say, hey, maybe it's not a good idea to lose all my medical assets at the same time I'm doing a major assault. You know, he was just a dumb infantryman as well, but you know, to his point, he's like, hey, this might not be a good idea, guys. And that caused people to step back and like, yeah, we might want to rethink that. So synchronization is Major Hamilton pointed out, with the other stuff, it's absolutely critical. Drive on the little command group. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Quick question. So has the lexicon support area command post or SACPs gone away?
Yes, with the publication in draft form of FM30, doctrine is reformatted so it's no longer support area, it's just deep, close, and rear. So RCP rear command post is.
So just a good designation, because you know I know Major Devlin mentioned it yesterday, but like we've heard the term SACP, some people are familiar with that, but just remember that the new lexicon, rear command post, RCP, not route clearance package.
Fair. All right, and briefly we touched on the mobile command group. That's again 2 to 3 trucks where the CG needs to go to personally observe this. So think like a battalion-sized TAC element, and a couple trucks. Couple key personnel, key staff personnel, and some PSD personnel. Okay. Next chart. CP displacement. We got a whole breakout on that. So if you got any questions, save it this afternoon. It's gonna be great. It's gonna be fun. It's gonna be great fun. And we'll move on. Colonel Anderson.
It just, everything is an operation. And if you look at something like it's gonna just be simple, and they're looking at something like, oh, we're just gonna knock that out, be leery. You know what I mean? Start asking them the questions that a prudent person would ask. You don't have to have a PhD in doctrine to understand that if they think something's gonna be easy, it ain't gonna be easy. It's gonna turn into a mess. Back to Colin's point, you know, having the planners back, a planner back there that can at least interface with the planners that are, you know, and it doesn't have to be a SAMS planner or anything else, but a dedicated person to look at what's happening next back there, and then telling the planners that are up at the division level, it pays dividends. If they try to short sell the rear command post, there'll just be a multitude of second, third order effects. So as they're setting things up, as they're doing things, just ask them the leading questions. Make sense? Good.
Any comments? Good. All right, hey, we'll take 5 and we'll drive on to the next fire squad. Thanks.